September 3rd, 1971. Kanab, Utah. The sun cracked over the canyon walls at 6:47 in the morning, and the dust from 40 horses still hadn't settled. Roy Callahan hadn't slept. He'd been awake since 3 a.m. in the cab of his truck, parked at the edge of a location shoot for the Cowboys, watching the sky go from black to rust to pale gold over the red rock bluffs of southern Utah. He was 67 years old, and he had driven 340 miles from Prescott, Arizona, with one saddle in the back of his truck. One. Because it was the only one left he hadn't sold at a loss. Every other craftsman here had come with equipment or props or gear ordered in advance by the production company. Roy hadn't been invited. Nobody had called him. He'd heard about the shoot from a man at a feed store in Flagstaff, and he'd simply come. The way a man comes when there is nowhere else left to go. By 7 a.m., he had set up behind a wooden workbench at the edge of the staging area and unwrapped the saddle from its oilcloth covering. It was a brown and tan hand-tooled saddle, 11 weeks in the making, with a hand-carved eagle on the right fender and a ring of small flowers along the skirt. The leather still smelled faintly of beeswax and neat's foot oil. Around him, commercial vendors were unloading factory saddles by the truckload. Smooth, uniform, machine-stitched, $80 apiece. The lead wrangler had already told Roy twice, politely but clearly, that they wouldn't be needing anything from him today. For a moment, no one moved. Roy stood behind his workbench in the Utah dust, and the whole world kept walking past him. Wranglers, crew members, production assistants. They moved through the staging area the way water moves around a stone, without noticing it. His saddle sat on the bench in the morning light, and not one person stopped. He reached for the oilcloth. His hands were already on the leather, already beginning to wrap it back up, already preparing for the drive home. 41 years of work, and he was folding it away like something that had never mattered. But that moment didn't start there. Because at exactly 7:22 a.m., before Roy's hands could finish what they'd started, a shadow fell across his workbench. Heavy boots on dry ground, slow, unhurried, the kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who had never once needed to hurry. Roy looked up. The man on the other side of the bench was large, not threatening, just solid, the way men are solid who have spent decades outdoors. He wore a canvas work jacket, trail-worn boots, and a plain ranch hat with a sweat ring at the brim. No assistant beside him. No entourage behind him. He had come alone, and he was not looking at Roy. He was looking at the saddle. If this story has ever happened to someone you love, someone whose work was invisible until one person finally stopped, share this video before you keep watching. They deserve to hear it too. Roy Callahan had spent 41 years making the finest saddles in Arizona. He had never once needed someone to tell him they were worth something. But the man now standing on the other side of that workbench, the man whose shadow stretched all the way to Roy's feet, was about to change everything. And Roy didn't even know who he was yet. But to understand what that shadow meant, you have to go back. Not to that morning in Kanab. Further. Prescott, Arizona, 1930. Roy Callahan's father, Harold, learned saddlery from a Navajo craftsman named Thomas Runningwater, who told him one thing that Harold repeated to Roy every single day of his apprenticeship. The saddle holds a man above the ground. If it's wrong, he falls. Make it so it's never wrong. Roy started cutting leather at age 12. By 20, he could build a full working saddle in 9 days. By 26, he had his own bench and his name on the door beside his father's. Callahan and Son, Custom Saddlery, established 1930. For 4 decades, that name meant something. Ranchers drove hours from New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado to buy a Callahan saddle. A Callahan saddle lasted 30 years. The stitching never pulled. The tree never cracked. The hand-tooled eagles and flowers on the skirt were carved one line at a time with a swivel knife, the way Thomas had taught Harold, and Harold had taught Roy. But by 1968, everything shifted. Mass-produced saddles from manufacturers in Fort Worth began flooding the market at a quarter of the price. Roy's customers, working ranchers, not collectors, couldn't justify the difference anymore. Orders slowed, then stopped. Roy took on repair work. Then he sold the back half of the workshop. Then he let his only apprentice go. Then came the county fairs and the roadside stops and the folding tables, standing behind his work while people glanced and walked on. Then came Margaret. Roy's wife had died in March of 1969. Lung disease. In the final 6 months of her illness, Roy had worked through the nights. Not to sell, but because the workshop was the only place that still made sense. He built 3 saddles during those months that he never offered for sale. He said they were practice pieces. They weren't. They were the only way he knew how to pray. Every flower he carved into the leather during those long nights was a conversation he couldn't have out loud. The saddle in the back of his truck, the one now sitting on the workbench in the Utah dust, was the last of those 3. Built the winter Margaret died. He had told himself he would sell it only if the right person asked. He had no way of knowing that the right person had just parked his truck 40 yards away. Back to 7:22 a.m., the shadow, the boots. Roy looked up. The man standing across the workbench didn't announce himself. He didn't nod or smile or say good morning. He simply stood there with both hands resting on the edge of the bench, his hat brim low against the morning light, and he studied the saddle the way a man studies something he already understands. Not with curiosity, with recognition. Roy watched him. The man's eyes moved slowly across the cantle stitching, then down to the fender, then to the hand-carved eagle on the right side. The one Roy had spent 4 days on alone, cutting each feather individually with the tip of his swivel knife the way Thomas Runningwater had taught Harold and Harold had taught Roy. The man leaned slightly forward. His eyes stopped on the eagle and stayed there. 10 seconds passed, then 20. "Who built this?" the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to fill silence. "I did," Roy said. "From scratch? From the tree up. 11 weeks. The man straightened. He looked at Roy directly for the first time. "You did the tooling yourself?" "Everything." A pause. His eyes went back to the saddle. "The eagle on the fender. That's not a stamp pattern. You cut that freehand." It wasn't a question. Roy's chest tightened, not with pride, but with the specific feeling of being seen by someone who actually knew what they were looking at. In 3 years of county fairs and folding tables, not one person had noticed the difference between a stamp pattern and freehand carving. This man had noticed it in 20 seconds. "My father taught me," Roy said. "He learned from a Navajo craftsman up near Flagstaff." The man nodded slowly. Then, quietly, "Can I sit in it?" Roy set the saddle on a sawhorse. The man removed his jacket, handed it to no one in particular, and swung into the saddle in one easy motion. No hesitation. The total absence of effort. He settled his weight, shifted once. Left, then right. The way an experienced rider checks a fit. Then he went completely still. Around them, without a word being spoken, people had begun to stop. 2 wranglers. Then a third. Then a grip from the film crew. Then the lead wrangler, the same man who had turned Roy away twice that morning, stood with his hat in his hands, watching. Nobody spoke, because something was happening that none of them could yet name. Don't go anywhere, because what this man says next stopped everyone on that set cold. Roy didn't know why a crowd was forming behind the man in the ranch hat. He didn't know why the lead wrangler had suddenly gone very quiet. He was about to find out exactly who was sitting in his saddle, and it was going to change every single thing. The man sat in Roy Callahan's saddle for 11 seconds without speaking, not shifting, not adjusting, just sitting, the way a rider sits when everything beneath him is exactly right and his body knows it before his mind catches up. The Utah Canyon behind them was absolutely still. The crowd that had gathered without anyone calling them, 30 people now, wranglers and grips and production assistants, stood in a loose half-circle and said nothing. Even the horses had gone quiet. Then the man looked down at the pommel, then at the fender, then at the eagle. "How much?" he said. $340, Roy said. The man nodded once. He didn't flinch. He didn't negotiate. "I'll take it." Roy should have said thank you. He should have taken the money and shaken the man's hand and loaded his truck and driven home to Prescott. $340 was more than he'd made in the last 2 months combined. But something stopped him. Some instinct older than money, older than pride. The instinct of a craftsman who needed to know his work had landed in the right hands. "Hold on," Roy said. "Who are you? Because you know saddles, and I'd like to know who's sitting in one of mine." The man looked at Roy for a long moment. Then he reached up and pushed back the brim of his hat. The crowd went silent in a different way. "John Wayne," he said simply, "and this is the finest saddle I've sat in since my father first put me on a horse." Roy Callahan didn't speak. He couldn't, because it wasn't the name that undid him. It was the second half of the sentence. Not the finest he'd seen, not the finest he'd found at a fair, the finest he had sat in. John Wayne, who had been on horseback in more than 80 films, who had worked alongside the greatest wranglers and prop masters in Hollywood for 4 decades, was sitting in Roy Callahan's saddle and calling it the finest. One of the wranglers slowly took off his hat, then another. Roy stood behind his workbench in the Utah morning and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not painfully, but the way a window cracks open after a long winter. Like the first air that comes through that actually feels like it belongs to a different season. But John Wayne wasn't finished, because what he said next, quietly, so that only Roy could hear it, had nothing to do with the saddle at all. And it made Roy Callahan weep openly for the first time since the day they buried Margaret. Wayne dismounted and handed the billfold to his assistant without looking at it. Pay the man. Then he did something no one in that crowd expected. He walked around to Roy's side of the workbench, not to examine the saddle again, to stand beside him. The way you stand beside someone, not across from them. He was looking at the flowers along the skirt. Roy had carved them last, February 1970. The month after Margaret's funeral, when the workshop was so quiet at night that he could hear the wood settling in the walls. He had carved 17 small flowers along the skirt of this saddle, not because any customer had asked for them, not because they added value, but because Margaret had kept a pot of yellow flowers on the kitchen windowsill for 31 years, and he didn't know what else to do with that fact. "The flowers," Wayne said quietly. "A working saddle doesn't need flowers. That's not craft. That's something else." Roy's hands went still on the bench. "My wife liked flowers," he said. "That was all. That was everything." Wayne nodded. He kept his eyes on the saddle. "I know what it means to put something into your hands that you can't say out loud," he said. "I've been doing it on film for 40 years. People call it acting. It isn't. It's the only honest thing some of us know how to do." The canyon was completely silent. "What was her name?" Wayne asked. "Margaret," Roy said. Wayne placed his hand on the saddle horn. "She knew you loved her," he said. "Not as a guess, not as comfort, but as a plain statement of fact, the way you say something true about someone you never met, but somehow already know. A man doesn't carve like this for someone who didn't know." Roy Callahan's chin dropped. His shoulders moved once. That was all. But every man in that circle looked away, because some moments are private, even when they happen in front of 30 people. Wayne left his hand on the saddle and said nothing more. He just stood there, beside Roy, until Roy straightened. Wayne used Roy's saddle for the entirety of the Cowboys production. He didn't put it in storage. He didn't let the prop department catalog it. He kept it on his personal horse, a gray quarter horse named Dollar. And every morning when he mounted for the first setup of the day, it was Roy Callahan's saddle beneath him. The director, Mark Rydell, asked about it on the 3rd day of shooting. Wayne told him where he got it and who made it. Rydell asked if he planned to return it after production. Wayne looked at him. "It's not a rental, Mark. It's mine." Word traveled the way it travels on a film set, person to person, wrangler to wrangler, department to department. By the end of the 2nd week, 4 of the film's stunt riders had driven to Prescott to find Roy Callahan's workshop. They found the old sign. Callahan and Son, Custom Saddlery, established 1930, leaning against the outside wall of the building because Roy had taken it down 6 weeks earlier but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He put it back up the morning after the first rider knocked on his door. By the time the Cowboys wrapped in November 1971, Roy had 14 orders backed up, more work than he'd seen in any single year since the mid-1960s. He hired back his apprentice, a young man named Davis Lowe, who had been working at a hardware store and wept when Roy called him. Wayne sent one final order in January 1972, not for himself, for the stuntman who had doubled for him in the film's most dangerous sequence. The note read, "He earned it. Build it the way you built mine. He'll know the difference." Roy built it in 8 weeks. He put flowers on the skirt again. 18 months after that morning in Kanab, a package arrived at the Prescott workshop with a Los Angeles postmark and no return address. Inside was a photograph, black and white, 8 by 10, taken on the set of The Cowboys. In it, John Wayne was mounted on Dollar, Roy's saddle visible beneath him, the hand-carved eagle on the fender catching the Utah light. On the back of the photograph, in Wayne's own handwriting, 4 words and a name: she knew. She always knew. J.W. Roy Callahan framed that photograph and hung it above his workbench, directly beneath the spot where his father's carving tools hung on the wall. He never sold it, never moved it, never spoke about it publicly. It was still hanging there the day he died, in 1989, at the age of 85. Still working, still cutting leather by hand, still using the same swivel knife Thomas Runningwater had taught Harold Callahan to use 6 decades before. Davis Lowe took over the workshop. He kept the sign. He kept the photograph. He kept the rule: make it so it's never wrong. John Wayne died in June 1979. Among his personal effects, his family found 2 saddles he had specified were never to be auctioned. One was from his first starring film. The other was a brown and tan hand-tooled saddle from a craftsman in Prescott, Arizona, with a hand-carved eagle on the right fender and 17 small flowers along the skirt. Roy Callahan spent 41 years making saddles that nobody wanted. And then one man stopped. That was all it took. One man who knew what he was looking at, who sat in it, felt it, and found inside the carved flowers of a grieving husband something worth saying out loud. The greatest craftsmen are never discovered. They are recognized. And recognition, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives the way John Wayne arrived that morning, unhurried, hat brim low, eyes already on the work. If this story moved you, subscribe, because every week we bring you the moments that made the golden era human. And leave a comment below. What do you think John Wayne felt when he saw those flowers? We read every single one.